Inside Hitler's war room. During Germany's collapse deep beneath Berlin, in a concrete bunker 25 feet underground, Adolf Hitler stared at a map that no longer reflected reality. It was April 1945. The Soviet artillery could be heard above. The walls shook with each explosion. But Hitler wasn't planning retreat. He was planning offensives with armies that no longer existed. Establish the scene. Welcome back. Today we're taking you inside one of history's most surreal and terrifying places, Hitler's war room during the final collapse of Nazi Germany. This isn't just about military defeat. This is about what happens when absolute power meets absolute delusion, when loyal officers must choose between truth and survival, and when an entire nation's fate rests in the hands of a man who has lost touch with reality. Set up the stakes. By early 1945, Germany was being crushed from all sides. The Soviets were advancing from the east, the Americans and British from the west. German cities were being reduced to rubble. Millions were dying. Yet inside the Führerbunker and the various military headquarters, Hitler and his staff continued to move phantom divisions across maps, planning counterattacks that would never come and issuing orders that could never be obeyed. Preview what's coming. In the next 30 minutes, we'll take you month by month through the final collapse. We'll show you what actually happened in those war rooms, the shouting matches, the desperate plans, the moment officers realized their leader had gone mad, and the terrible choices they faced. We'll reveal the actual conversations, the intercepted orders, and the first-hand accounts from the men who were there when the Third Reich died. This is the story of how Hitler's war room became a theatre of the absurd, where fantasy replaced strategy, and where the gap between what Hitler believed and what was actually happening grew so vast that reality itself seemed to break down. January 1945. The illusion shatters. Set the stage. January 1st, 1945, Hitler delivered his New Year's address to the German people, promising that 1945 would bring final victory. He spoke of new weapons, of armies regrouping, of the inevitable destruction of the Allied coalition. His voice was confident, assured, prophetic. But inside his military headquarters, reality was very different. The Eastern Front catastrophe. On January 12th, the Soviet Union launched Operation Vistula Oder, the largest offensive in human history. Over 2 million Soviet troops, supported by thousands of tanks and artillery pieces, smashed into German lines in Poland. The German Army Group A, tasked with defending this sector, had been bled white by years of fighting. They had perhaps 400,000 men, many of them poorly trained conscripts and teenage boys from the Hitler Youth. In the war room at the Reich Chancellery, Hitler's chief of the Army General Staff, General Heinz Guderian, tried to explain the situation. Mein Führer, the Soviets have achieved a breakthrough of enormous proportions. Army Group A is in danger of complete encirclement. We must authorize a strategic withdrawal to save... Withdrawal. Hitler's voice rose. There will be no withdrawal. Every metre of ground will be held. Where is the 6th Panzer Army? Order them to counterattack immediately. Guderian exchanged glances with the other officers present. The 6th Panzer Army was in Hungary, over 500 miles away, engaged in a desperate and failing offensive. Even if they could disengage, which they couldn't, it would take weeks to move them north. Mein Führer, Guderian continued carefully, the 6th Panzer Army is currently committed in Hungary. We could perhaps redirect some units from... I don't want excuses. Hitler slammed his hand on the map table. I want action. The Soviets will be thrown back. This is my order. The gap between reality and delusion. This scene would repeat itself, with variations, hundreds of times over the next 4 months. Hitler would issue orders. His generals would try to explain why those orders couldn't be executed. Hitler would rage, accuse them of defeatism, sometimes of treason. The officers would leave, knowing they faced an impossible choice: obey impossible orders and watch their men die for nothing, or disobey and face execution. General Gotthard Heinrizi, who would later command the defense of Berlin, described the atmosphere in the war room. It was like being in an asylum where the inmates had taken over, except the inmates had the power to kill you. Every conference was an exercise in avoiding reality while pretending to embrace it. We couldn't tell him the truth, but we also couldn't make his fantasies real. The January offensive continues. By January 17th, Soviet forces had advanced over 200 miles in just 5 days. They had liberated Warsaw. They were approaching the German border. Entire German divisions had simply ceased to exist, not destroyed in battle, but scattered, surrounded, or captured. In the war room, Hitler's response was to create new armies on paper. The 11th Army will be formed from reserves, he declared. They will counterattack from East Prussia and cut off the Soviet spearheads. The 11th Army existed only in Hitler's imagination. The reserves he spoke of were mostly boys under 16 and men over 60, with minimal training and almost no heavy weapons. But on the map, Hitler drew arrows showing how this phantom army would sweep the Soviets back to the Vistula River. The officer's dilemma. Colonel Bernd Freitag von Loringhoven, a staff officer who was present at many of these conferences, later wrote, "We all knew it was madness. We all knew the war was lost, but what could we do? If you spoke too plainly, you might be arrested by the Gestapo. If you tried to act independently, you'd be relieved of command and probably shot." So we nodded. We said, "Yes, mein Führer," and then we went out and tried to do what we could with what we actually had, which was almost nothing. By the end of January, the Soviets had reached the Oder River, less than 50 miles from Berlin. In the war room, Hitler was still planning grand offensives. Outside, German refugees were flooding westward, fleeing the advancing Red Army. The gap between the war Hitler was fighting on his maps and the war actually being fought had become a chasm. February 1945, the bunker mentality, the move underground. In early February, with Allied bombing raids devastating Berlin day and night, Hitler moved his headquarters permanently into the Führer bunker, a reinforced concrete shelter beneath the Reich Chancellery garden. The bunker was cramped, poorly ventilated, and lit by harsh electric lights that never changed. Day and night became meaningless. Time itself seemed to warp. The bunker complex had 2 levels. The upper level, the Vorbunker, housed support staff, kitchens and some living quarters. The lower level, the Führer bunker proper, contained Hitler's personal rooms, a conference room that served as the war room, and accommodations for his closest staff. This would be where the final act of the Third Reich would play out. The conference room. The bunker's conference room was small, perhaps 15 feet by 20 feet. A large map table dominated the center. The walls were bare concrete. The air was stale, recycled through inadequate ventilation systems. Officers crowded into this space twice a day, at noon and midnight for situation briefings that often lasted hours. Lieutenant General Wilhelm Burgdorf, Hitler's chief adjutant, described the atmosphere. The bunker was like a tomb for the living. Everyone who entered felt it, the oppressive closeness, the constant hum of the ventilation, the knowledge that above us Berlin was being destroyed, and in the center of it all, the Führer, increasingly detached from reality, moving divisions that didn't exist across maps that showed a situation that was weeks out of date. Operation Sonnenwende, a fantasy offensive. On February 15th, Hitler launched Operation Sonnenwende, Solstice, designed to relieve German forces surrounded in Pomerania and throw the Soviets back from the Oder River. On the map in the bunker, it looked impressive. Multiple German armies would converge on the Soviet spearheads, cutting them off and destroying them. In reality, the armies Hitler was moving were corps at best, divisions in practice. The 3rd Panzer Army, which was supposed to spearhead the attack, could barely muster 200 operational tanks, less than a single full-strength division should have had. SS Obergruppenführer Felix Steiner, commanding the attacking forces, knew it was hopeless before it began, but he also knew better than to tell Hitler. The operation began on February 16th. Within 3 days, it had stalled. The Soviets had overwhelming numerical superiority. Every German attack was met with devastating artillery fire and immediate counterattacks. The rage. When news of the offensive's failure reached the bunker, Hitler erupted. According to multiple witnesses, he screamed for nearly an hour, accusing his generals of betrayal, incompetence, and cowardice. He specifically blamed the SS units for not attacking with sufficient fanaticism. "Where is the German spirit?" he shouted. "Where is the will to victory? My orders are ignored. My plans are sabotaged. I am surrounded by traitors." Guderian, never one to remain silent, responded with unusual boldness. "Mein Führer, the German spirit and will to victory remain strong, but spirit cannot stop Soviet tanks when our soldiers have no fuel, no ammunition and no air support. We are asking impossible things of men who have given everything." Hitler stared at Guderian with undisguised hatred. For a moment, everyone thought Guderian would be arrested on the spot. Instead, Hitler simply turned away. "Get out," he said quietly. "All of you, get out." The Western Front collapses. While Hitler fixated on the Eastern Front, the Western Front was also collapsing. American forces had crossed the Roer River. The British were advancing toward the Rhine. Yet in the bunker war room, the Western Front received almost no attention. When Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt's chief of staff tried to brief Hitler on the situation in the West, Hitler cut him off. "The West is secondary. The decisive battle is in the East. All our forces must focus there." "But, mein Führer," the officer protested, "the Americans are—" "I don't care what the Americans are doing," Hitler snapped. "The Soviets are the real enemy. The Soviets must be stopped. Everything else is irrelevant." This was Hitler's strategic blindness in its purest form. He couldn't accept that Germany was fighting a two-front war it couldn't win, so he simply ignored one front and pretended the other could be held with forces that didn't exist. The first hints of suicide. It was in February that those closest to Hitler began hearing him speak of suicide, not openly, not in the war conferences, but in private moments. His secretaries heard him say things like, "I will never leave Berlin. I will die in this city." His valet reported him staring at his pistol late at night. The man who had promised to conquer the world was beginning to contemplate how he would end his life, but he wasn't ready yet. First, he would drag Germany down with him. March 1945, crossing the Rubicon. The Rhine is crossed. March 7th, 1945. An American patrol discovered that the Ludendorff Bridge at Remagen was still standing. Within hours, American forces were streaming across the Rhine, Germany's last great natural barrier in the West. It was a catastrophe of the first order. When the news reached Hitler's bunker, his response was predictable and terrifying. He immediately ordered the execution of 4 officers who had been responsible for demolishing the bridge. 3 were executed within days. The 4th was already dead, killed in the fighting. More significantly, Hitler issued Führerbefehl, Führer order, demanding that every bridge, every building, every resource in Germany be destroyed rather than allow it to fall into enemy hands intact. This was the infamous Nero Decree, Hitler's scorched earth policy that would have left Germany a wasteland. Speer's rebellion. Albert Speer, Hitler's Minister of Armaments and longtime confidant, was one of the few men brave enough to directly challenge this order. In a memorandum delivered to Hitler on March 15th, Speer wrote, "The war is lost. Within 4 to 8 weeks, the final collapse is inevitable. We must preserve what remains for the German people's survival. Destroying our infrastructure will condemn millions to starvation." When Speer met with Hitler in the bunker to discuss the memorandum, Hitler was ice cold. "If the war is lost, the nation will also perish," Hitler told him. "There is no need to consider the basis even of a primitive existence any longer. On the contrary, it's better to destroy these things ourselves. The nation has proved itself weak, and the future belongs solely to the stronger Eastern nation. Besides, those who remain after the battle are of little value, for the good have fallen." Speer was stunned. Hitler was willing to destroy Germany entirely rather than admit defeat. This wasn't just military strategy, this was nihilism, a death cult mentality that would take an entire nation into the grave. Despite Hitler's orders, Speer would spend the next week secretly travelling Germany, countermanding the Nero Decree wherever possible, saving bridges and factories from demolition. He was committing treason, and he knew it, but he believed Germany had to survive beyond Hitler. The Eastern Front. No more reserves. By mid-March, the situation in the east had become truly desperate. The Soviets had cleared all of Pomerania. They had established strong bridgeheads across the Oder. They were preparing for the final assault on Berlin. In the war room, Hitler still spoke of counter-offensives. He ordered the Ninth Army to attack northward from the Oder. He commanded Army Group Vistula to strike southward. These two armies would meet, encircling the Soviet forces and driving them back to Poland. General Theodor Bussy, commanding the Ninth Army, knew it was fantasy. His army had perhaps 200,000 men, many of them elderly Volkssturm, Home Guard, with World War I rifles. They faced over 1 million Soviet troops with thousands of tanks and overwhelming air superiority. Busse sent his chief of staff to the bunker to explain the situation. Hitler refused to see him. Instead, he sent word through an adjutant. The Ninth Army will attack as ordered. Any further objections will be considered defeatism. The attack never happened. Busse simply didn't have the forces to execute it, but he couldn't tell Hitler that directly. So he reported local defensive actions and preparations for offensive operations while actually just trying to keep his battered units from disintegrating. The War of Ghosts. By late March, the war Hitler was fighting in his bunker had almost no connection to the real war being fought above ground. He issued orders to divisions that existed only on paper. He demanded reports from the armies that had been destroyed weeks earlier. When officers tried to tell him the truth, he accused them of lying or betraying him. Freitag von Loringhoven described the conference room as a theatre of ghosts where phantom armies fought phantom battles on maps that showed a Germany that no longer existed. Hitler would point to a position on the map and say, "The Führer Grenadier Division will counterattack here." Someone would have to gently mention that the Führer Grenadier Division had been destroyed at Budapest in February. Hitler would wave this away, then reconstitute it, use the reserves. There were no reserves. There hadn't been reserves for months. Germany was scraping the bottom of the barrel, conscripting anyone who could hold a weapon. But in Hitler's mind, there were always reserves, always reinforcements coming, always one more division that could turn the tide. The last offensive. On March 6th, Hitler launched Germany's last offensive of the war, Operation Frühlingserwachen, Spring Awakening, in Hungary. The goal was to recapture the Hungarian oil fields, protect Vienna, and possibly force the Soviets into a negotiated peace. The 6th SS Panzer Army, which Hitler had held back as his last mobile reserve, was committed to this offensive. For a few days they made progress. But by March 15th, the attack had stalled. The Soviets launched a massive counteroffensive. Within weeks, all the German gains had been reversed, and the 6th SS Panzer Army, Hitler's elite force, was shattered. When Hitler learned that the SS divisions had retreated without permission, he was furious. He ordered that they be stripped of their honorific armband titles, a devastating insult in the SS's eyes. Even the fanatically loyal Waffen-SS had failed him. Sepp Dietrich, commanding the 6th SS Panzer Army, later said, "We had just lost thousands of men in a pointless offensive ordered by a madman, and his response was to dishonor us. That was when I knew, absolutely knew, that Hitler had lost his mind." April 1945. The final collapse. The Vistula-Oder offensive begins. April 16th, 1945, 3 a.m. The Soviet artillery barrage began. Over 20,000 guns opened fire simultaneously along a front of several hundred miles. The ground shook. The sky turned red. This was the beginning of the Battle of Berlin, the final Soviet offensive that would end the war in Europe. In the Führer bunker, the sound of the barrage was clearly audible even 25 feet underground. Hitler had been awake, studying his maps. When the bombardment began, he called an emergency conference. By the time his generals arrived at 6 a.m., Hitler had already decided on his response. "The Ninth Army will hold the Silo Heights at all costs," he declared. "Army Group Vistula will counterattack the Soviet flanks. This is the battle that will decide the war. The Bolsheviks will break themselves against our defenses." General Heinrizi, commanding Army Group Vistula, knew better. The Silo Heights were the last significant defensive position before Berlin. They were heavily fortified, but the forces defending them, a mix of regular army, Volkssturm and Hitler Youth, were hopelessly outnumbered. "Mein Führer!" Heinrici said carefully. "We estimate the Soviets have committed over 2.5 million men to this offensive. We have perhaps 500,000 defenders, many of them not combat ready. We cannot hold indefinitely." Hitler's eyes blazed. "We will hold because we must hold. There is nowhere left to retreat. This is where we stop them." For once, Hitler was right about one thing. There was nowhere left to retreat, but he was wrong about everything else. The Seelow Heights fall. The Battle of Seelow Heights lasted 3 days. The Germans fought with desperate courage, knowing this was truly the last stand. Hitler Youth boys manned anti-tank guns, facing down Soviet tank columns. Old men from the Volkssturm fired their rifles until they ran out of ammunition, then fought with grenades and whatever else they had. In the bunker, Hitler received reports of fierce defensive fighting and heavy Soviet casualties. These were true. The Soviets took horrific losses at Seelow Heights, perhaps 30,000 dead in 3 days. But they had the men to spare. Germany didn't. By April 19th, the Heights had fallen. Soviet forces were advancing on Berlin from 3 directions. The encirclement of the city was beginning. When Hitler learned that the Heights had fallen, he retreated to his private quarters for several hours. When he emerged, his hands were shaking. His left arm trembled uncontrollably, a symptom that had been getting worse for months. But his voice was firm. "Steiner will counterattack," he announced. "Steiner's army will strike the Soviet flank and cut off their advance." The Steiner Phantom. Steiner's army was actually a scratch force of perhaps 10,000 men. Many of them support troops and clerks who had never seen combat. They had almost no heavy weapons and no air support. Hitler had ordered Steiner to gather all available forces and attack immediately. Steiner knew it was suicide. He also knew that disobeying a direct Führer order meant death. So he did what many German commanders had been doing for months. He stalled. He reported that he was assembling forces and preparing for the offensive. He hoped that events would overtake the order, making it irrelevant. He was right, but not before one final terrible scene in the bunker. April 22nd, the breakdown. April 22nd, 1945, the noon situation conference in the Führer bunker. Hitler demanded an update on Steiner's counteroffensive. There was a long, terrible silence. Finally, someone spoke. "Mein Führer, Steiner reports that he cannot execute the ordered attack. He states that he lacks sufficient forces and..." Hitler exploded. According to every witness present, this was the worst outburst they had ever seen. Hitler screamed that he had been betrayed by everyone, that the war was lost because of the cowardice and treachery of his generals, that the German people had failed him. "The war is lost!" Hitler shrieked. "Everything is lost! You have all betrayed me! The German people are not worthy of me!" He collapsed into his chair, trembling. For several minutes, no one spoke. Then Hitler said, more quietly, "I will remain in Berlin. I will defend the Reich Chancellery to the last. Anyone who wishes to leave may do so. I am staying here." This was the moment. Hitler had finally admitted that the war was lost, and in admitting it, he had chosen death over surrender. The last orders. For the next week, as Berlin burned and Soviet forces fought their way street by street toward the Reich Chancellery, Hitler continued to hold conferences in the bunker. But they had changed. There were no more grand offensives planned, no more phantom armies being moved across the maps. Instead, Hitler issued orders for the defense of specific buildings, specific street corners. He micromanaged the placement of individual anti-tank guns. When told that ammunition was running out, he ordered ammunition. When informed that the ammunition depots were in Soviet hands, he raged briefly, then moved on. General Helmuth Weidling, the last commander of the Berlin defense area, described the bunker in its final days. It was like being at the court of a dying king. Everyone knew the end was coming, but no one knew how to bring it about. Hitler would not surrender. He would not leave Berlin. He would not negotiate. He was determined to die and to take Berlin with him. The wedding and the will. On April 29th, with Soviet forces less than a quarter-mile away, Hitler married his longtime companion Eva Braun in a brief civil ceremony in the bunker. After the ceremony, he dictated his personal and political testaments. In his political testament, Hitler blamed everyone but himself for Germany's defeat. He blamed the Jews for starting the war. He blamed his generals for being too weak. He blamed the German people for not being worthy of his leadership. He took no responsibility for anything. He also expelled Hermann Göring and Heinrich Himmler from the Nazi Party for attempting to negotiate with the Allies behind his back. He appointed Grand Admiral Karl Dönitz as his successor as President of Germany and Joseph Goebbels as Chancellor. Then he ordered copies of both testaments sent out of Berlin to ensure his final words would survive him. April 30th, the end. April 30th, 1945, approximately 3:30 p.m. Hitler said goodbye to his remaining staff. He shook hands with each person. His hand was cold and trembling. Then he and Eva Braun retreated to his personal sitting room. A few minutes later, a single gunshot was heard. When staff members entered the room, they found Hitler dead from a self-inflicted gunshot wound to the head. Eva Braun had taken cyanide. As per Hitler's orders, their bodies were carried to the Reich Chancellery garden, doused with gasoline and burned. In the bunker's war room, a few officers remained, staring at maps that no longer mattered. Above them, Berlin was still fighting. The war would continue for another week. But Hitler's war, the delusional, fantastical war of phantom armies and impossible victories, was finally over. The aftermath and reflection. The final conference. After Hitler's death, Goebbels held one last situation conference in the bunker. It lasted less than 10 minutes. There was nothing to discuss, no plans to make, no orders to give. The war room that had been the centre of Nazi power, where decisions had been made that affected millions, was now just an empty room with useless maps. Goebbels himself would commit suicide the next day, along with his wife, after murdering their 6 children. He couldn't imagine a world where the Third Reich no longer existed. On May 2nd, General Weidling surrendered Berlin to the Soviets. The war in Europe would officially end on May 8th. Adolf Hitler's 1,000-year Reich had lasted exactly 12 years and 3 months. What the war room reveals. What does the story of Hitler's war room tell us? Several things, and they're worth reflecting on. First, it shows us the danger of absolute power meeting absolute belief. Hitler had convinced himself that willpower could overcome material reality. If he simply refused to accept defeat, if he demanded enough of his soldiers, if he maintained absolute certainty in victory, then victory would come. This is magical thinking, and it killed millions. Second, it demonstrates what happens when those around a leader are too afraid to tell the truth. The German generals knew the war was lost by late 1944 at the latest, but they couldn't tell Hitler. Some feared for their lives. Some hoped he might somehow be right. Some simply couldn't bring themselves to believe that everything they'd fought for was ending in catastrophe. This created a feedback loop of delusion. Hitler believed the fantasies because no one contradicted them effectively. His subordinates couldn't contradict them because Hitler wouldn't accept contradiction. Reality became whatever Hitler said it was, until reality literally exploded through the ceiling of his bunker. The responsibility question. Were Hitler's generals victims or accomplices? This question haunted Germany for decades after the war. Many of them claimed at the Nuremberg trials and afterward that they were just following orders, that they had no choice, that speaking up would have meant death. There's some truth to this. Hitler did execute officers who defied him. The atmosphere of terror was real, but it's also true that these generals facilitated Hitler's crimes for years before the final collapse. They planned the invasions. They implemented the criminal orders. They looked away from the atrocities. By 1945, when reality could no longer be denied, it was far too late. The generals in that bunker war room had helped create the monster they now served. They had benefited from his victories. Now, they were trapped in his defeat. The human cost. While Hitler played with maps in his bunker, millions were dying above ground. German civilians were being killed in bombing raids. German soldiers were dying in hopeless last stands. Concentration camp inmates were being murdered in the final days as the camps were evacuated. Soviet, American and British soldiers were dying to end a war that Germany's leaders knew was already lost. Every day Hitler refused to surrender. thousands more people died. Every phantom offensive he ordered, every impossible defense he commanded, cost lives that could have been saved. In his determination to never admit defeat, Hitler inflicted a final, terrible bloodletting on Germany and the world. The bunker, today. The Führerbunker no longer exists. After the war, the Soviets destroyed what they could of it. Later, when the area came under East German control, most of the remaining structure was buried and built over. Today, a parking lot and apartment buildings stand where Hitler spent his final days. There's no monument, no plaque, nothing to mark the spot. Germany made a deliberate choice not to create any shrine that neo-Nazis might venerate. The past is remembered, but this particular place is deliberately forgotten. Lessons for today. What lessons can we draw from Hitler's war room? Several suggest themselves. First, question authority. When leaders make claims that don't match observable reality, investigate. Don't assume they know something you don't. Sometimes they're just wrong. Second, speak truth to power. It's hard. It can be dangerous. But when everyone around a leader is too afraid to contradict them, disasters follow. Someone has to be willing to say, "This isn't working," or "This is wrong." Third, acknowledge reality. You can't wish away problems. You can't bend reality to your will through sheer determination. The map is not the territory. The plan is not the outcome. Reality doesn't care about your ideology. Fourth, know when to quit. There is no shame in recognizing a lost cause. There is enormous shame in dragging others down with you in a pointless gesture of defiance. Hitler should have surrendered in January 1945. By fighting on, he only multiplied the suffering. The story of Hitler's war room is ultimately a tragedy, not for Hitler, who deserved his fate, but for the millions who suffered because of the delusions that played out in that underground conference room. It's a reminder that leaders, no matter how powerful they seem, are still just human beings capable of self-deception, denial, and catastrophic misjudgment. And when those leaders have absolute power, their delusions can destroy nations. The war room in the Führerbunker was where fantasy and reality finally catastrophically collided, where the myths Hitler had built crashed against the truth he had tried so hard to deny, where the gap between what he believed and what actually existed finally became so vast that not even he could ignore it. And in the end, rather than face that reality, he chose to die. But not before ensuring that millions would die with him. Thank you for watching this deep dive into one of history's darkest places. If you found this video informative, please like, subscribe, and share. Leave a comment below with your thoughts. Do you think Hitler's generals bear responsibility for not stopping him? Could anyone have changed the outcome? Let's discuss. And remember, the lessons of history aren't just about the past, they're warnings for the future. The kind of delusional thinking that filled Hitler's war room can happen anywhere, at any time, when power meets ego and reality becomes optional. Until next time, stay curious, stay skeptical, and never stop questioning.